Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@LarsLarson.com. I want to talk about a subject, yes, that goes outside of counting votes and the sanctity of elections, and even outside the coronavirus and the pandemic. It's about a legal case that was brought, and I thought it was a very, very solid legal case. A group of Asian American students said, I think reasonably, hey, Harvard University, the nation's oldest university, a private institution, had said, we're going to set up a set of rules that effectively say, if you are black or Hispanic, you may be able to get into Harvard with lower test scores and lower GPA, lower academic qualifications than most of the students. But what they also said was, if you happen to be Asian American, well, then we're going to hold you to an even higher standard, simply because of your race or ethnicity, nation of origin, that sort of thing. And I thought, well, they've got a solid case there. Harvard is doing exactly that. So they went to the courts. Unfortunately, a federal appeals court has said Harvard didn't intentionally discriminate against Asian American applicants. Well, I think it did. So I thought to straighten this out, I'll bring on Mike Gonzalez, who's a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and the author of The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Mike, welcome back to the program. And this one is right solidly in the middle of your lane, isn't it?
Lars, first of all, it's great to hear your great sonorous voice again. And you're absolutely right. This is an outrage, but it's an outrage that was expected, because what the courts are basically saying is what Harvard doing has been permitted by the Supreme Court, which means it's permitted by the Constitution. We know this is not permitted by the Constitution, and I can't wait for it to get to the new refashioned Supreme Court, and as it eventually will.
Sure. But without getting too far into the legal details, because I'm not a lawyer, the basics of this are the Constitution says we all have to be equal under the law, and that in public accommodations, I know when you hear public accommodations, people think Motel 6, but Harvard also is a public accommodation. They do business. They say we will take in students. If they set up a standard that says, I mean, if Motel 6, for example, Mike, were to say, if you're white, the charge is $30 a night for a room. If you're black, the charge is $25 a night. You get a few dollars off. But if you're Asian and you want to stay in our hotel, it's going to be $40. You have to meet a higher standard. Is that a simple way of expressing what Harvard has done and how it violates the idea of equal protection?
Absolutely. This is in clear violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Harvard takes a lot of money from the federal government and from all governments. It takes millions and millions and millions every year. It takes more in taxpayers' money than it does in school tuition. For that reason, it means it cannot discriminate. Now, as you know, previous Supreme Court decisions have held that, well, if it's held as a plus factor, race can be considered holistically. It always ends up in quotas, and that's the problem with it. Quotas are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has said quotas are unconstitutional, but you can use it as a plus factor in a holistic approach. It is impossible. It becomes you have to be an alchemist to try to understand how this would be done without it being a quota. In fact, in the Harvard case, it is clear to people who have looked at the matter that Harvard is using the same approach it did with Asian Americans that it did with Jewish Americans in the 1920s. In other words, it is looking for characteristics that are usually associated with non-Asians and that are usually associated back then with non-Jews, with Gentiles. This is illegal.
It doesn't work. And Mike, I'm an employer. I only have 3 employees. They're great producers. But if I lost one and had to replace them and said, well, I want to be woke. This is not me, but I want to be PC. I want to sign up for identity politics. If I were to say, I'm considering 2 people for a job, but one of them is black or Hispanic. Say you were applying for a job. I say, well, Mike Gonzalez, I'd like to have a Hispanic, a Latino member of my crew. But Mike isn't as well qualified as Joe or Sally over here. But I'm going to hire him anyway. In fact, I'm going to take his race into account, his ethnicity into account, and I'm going to put him on the payroll instead of the better qualified employee. I'd be violating the law, wouldn't I?
Not only that, but you'd be violating natural law. Everybody would suffer, right? So that more talented person who's not named Gonzalez would suffer. You would suffer. You would get worse worst performance, your audience would suffer, but I would suffer. I suffer because if I'm elevated without acquiring the skills that I need to have, then I will never acquire those skills. And I will always be a subpar performer. So it is something where everybody loses. Everyone loses. We're not a society of castes. We should not have castes in society. By the way, it is incredibly insulting to think that a guy named Gonzalez or a guy who is of another race actually needs to have the help of, they need to, for somebody to put their thumb on the scale. That fundamentally, that is an insulting thing to say to anybody.
You know, Mike, I have my questions about the Bush family these days, but there was one phrase that came out of George W., I think it was, who called it the soft bigotry of low expectations. And it really is a kind of bigotry to say, oh, I'm going to hire Mike Gonzalez, but, you know, his last name is Gonzalez, so he can't possibly be as good a producer as my other producers because he's Hispanic. You'd say, well, hold on. That's a bigoted point of view, Lars. And I'd say, yes, you're absolutely right. But that's what Harvard is saying is legitimate to do. And then to say, oh, but we understand Asians as a group. They're just smarter, quicker. They get better high school GPAs. They do better on the SAT score. So we're going to have the handicapper general, to quote a Kurt Vonnegut story, the handicapper general has to work on Asian Americans. They have to go through life with a handicap. You'll have to score even better to get in if your last name, you know, is Asian than you do if your name is Gonzalez. It really is a kind of bigotry, and now it's being baked into the cake.
And this is why a lot of writers, me included, think that we're now kind of we're living under two separate constitutions in this country. We have the Constitution of 1787, framed, approved the following year, 1788, which says, as amended through the centuries, which says no, you cannot. All American citizens deserve equal protection under the law. And you have this other Constitution, which is the Identity Politics Constitution, which says that no, members of some categories are going to be given benefits that are denied to other categories. That violates the first Constitution. We need to resolve this. And until we resolve this, we're not going to have normal politics. We're going to have regime politics, which is the reason why everybody's so mad at each other, which is the reason why we're so polarized. We're polarized for that reason, because we're no longer acting as if we're all under the same Constitution. That's the reason I wrote my book, by the way, The Plot to Change America, to dispel all these myths so people would understand how these categories were created, who thought of this, but especially why they did it. It is a plot, in that the goal, it's a project by the left to transform the country.
I'm talking to Mike Gonzalez, whose book is The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Mike, my wife always tells me I'm a happy warrior. I wake up and no matter how many knocks I get, I mean, we all get bad news here and there, things that don't work out well. I say, okay, we're going to just launch into the next day and I'm going to do better today. So give me some hope for this. When this ridiculous decision from the Federal Appeals Court in Boston gets to the Supreme Court, can we at least expect a reasonable decision there that Harvard is breaking not only the law but the Constitution?
Nobody, only a fool, would forecast what the Supreme Court is going to say. However, Senator O'Connor in 2003 in Bollinger said this can only go on for 25 years. She was writing 25 years after Bakke, the decision that first allowed the affirmative action.
Yep.
And in Bollinger, she wrote, only that date is coming up in 2028. I do not see how a true originalist can deem this to be constitutional.
No, absolutely not. Mike Gonzalez, his book is The Plot to Change America from the Heritage Foundation. Mike, it's always a pleasure. Coming up in a moment, we'll talk about Dominion software and how it screwed up this year's presidential election.